Welcome to Bobby Does Recaps. This is Interview with the Vampire, Season 2. All right, quick refresher. Season 1 ended with Louis and Claudia sending Lestat to the dump and fleeing New Orleans. In Season 2, both timelines are very important, and we need to track both. We start in Eastern Europe. Louis and Claudia spend years slogging through bombed-out, war-ravaged villages hunting for other vampires. They eventually find some. They are not what Claudia had in mind. One of these things is feral, like full raccoon. No culture, no conversation, barely functioning. The other is an ancient female vampire named Draconia. Long story short, she throws herself into a fire right in front of them. So Eastern Europe turned out to be a great trip. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. Yeah, not. And to make things worse, throughout the whole trip, Louis is haunted by a hallucination of Lestat. Bloody, smirking, following him everywhere, because apparently you can drain a vampire, send him to the dump, and he still takes up permanent residence in your brain rent-free. They eventually give up and head to Paris, a post-war Paris. And Paris is where it gets interesting. The local vampire coven, based out of a gothic performance space called the Théâtre des Vampires, has already spotted them. And just to let you know, for the sake of my sanity, we're going to pronounce that Theater des Vampires from here on out. I gave you the correct pronunciation once. So they watch them, but they just watch for 5 months. No contact, no introduction, nothing. They're just out there being incredibly patient and incredibly creepy. Finally, the coven's ancient leader, a man named Armand, approaches Louis in a park and invites them to see the show. The Theater des Vampires is exactly what it sounds like. Vampires performing for a human audience who think it's all elaborate theater. The grand finale of every show, they drag out a real human and they feed on them while the crowd applauds because they think it's a stunning stagecraft. It's not a stagecraft. The humans are actually dinner. The crowd loves this part, especially the wannabe vampires always in the front row. Claudia is completely spellbound. Community, identity, belonging. She wants in. Whereas Louis is uncomfortable. And then to make things worse, he spots a portrait backstage of the theater's co-founder. You guessed it, it's Lestat de Lioncourt. Because of course it is. Claudia tells the coven that their maker was a vampire named Bruce who tragically perished in a fire. Completely fabricated on the spot. Solid improv. The problem? She still has the entire true story in her diary in detail, including Lestat's final words written in his own blood in the diary that she left in the apartment. She survived decades of vampire life, but apparently never met a loose end she didn't trip over. Meanwhile, Armand is actively courting Louis. He takes him on private tours of the Paris sewers, and he confesses his feelings like it's a Nicholas Sparks movie with fangs. He also drops, completely casually, that Claudia, turned so young, will eventually go insane. That's some first date energy right there. Claudia gets initiated into the coven with the full ritual and ceremony. She is absolutely pumped. And then they inform her that her permanent role in the troupe will be playing a little girl in a show called, and I'm not making this up, My Baby Loves Windows. And she'll be doing it for the next 50 years. Yeah, she probably should have asked more questions before swearing allegiance to the coven. She copes by befriending a human dressmaker named Madeline, a woman already shunned by her community for fraternizing with a German officer during the occupation. Two outcasts, instant bond. Claudia eventually begs Louis to turn Madeline so she won't be alone. Louis says no, then says yes, because in the end, Louis has never been able to deny Claudia anything. And that's when it all falls apart. Santiago, the coven's star performer and the most theatrical dude you have ever seen in your life, breaks into Claudia's apartment while she's out and helps himself to the diary, the honest one, with the blood. He brings it straight to Armand, and Armand does nothing to stop what comes next. Santiago and the coven abduct all three of them and drag them back to the theater for a trial. And then, walking in like he owns the place, which to be fair, he kind of does, Lestat de Lioncourt, alive, radiating fury. He testifies against Louis and Claudia in front of the entire coven. And Santiago reads from Claudia's diary out loud like it's closing arguments. The coven has everything they need to bury him. Claudia and Madeline are sentenced to death, dragged into a concentrated beam of sunlight on stage, while the human audience thinks it's just another performance. Now, prior to this, Madeline is offered an out. She could join the coven and denounce Claudia, but she doesn't take it. She chooses death with Claudia, and Claudia, in the most Claudia move possible, doesn't beg. She sings a mocking song straight at her executioners. Then she's ash, both of them. Now, Louis has a different fate. Locked in a coffin full of rocks, sealed in a crypt, starving in the dark. He later is led to believe that Armand used his ancient vampire powers to get him banished instead of executed. That Armand saved his life. And he holds on to this for the next 7 decades. And he's wrong. But we'll come back to that. Now, eventually, Armand does free Louis from the coffin. And Louis, running completely on grief and rage at this point, burns the Théâtre des Vampires to the ground, and then hunts down every surviving coven member. Santiago tries to ambush him through a sewer manhole, but Louis intercepts him and takes his head clean off, which, honestly, I respect it. He finds Lestat in the Paris sewers. Both of them are completely broken. They kind of barely speak, and then Louis leaves with Armand because he still thinks Armand is the good guy. Now, back to Dubai. Daniel Malloy has been quietly receiving files from a man named Raglan James, an agent of the Talamasca, a secret organization that tracks vampires globally. Side note, James also earlier mentioned offhand that Daniel's predecessors who tried to interview vampires are all either dead or undead now. But Daniel's sick, old, and quite frankly, tough as nails, so he's not scared. Now, here's what Daniel has pieced together. In 1973, Louis did this exact same interview with a young, strung-out Daniel in a San Francisco apartment. Armand came home, found them together, and lost his mind. He tortured Daniel mentally and physically, then wiped his memory rather than kill him, leaving Daniel with fractured, gaslit recollections and Louis with a carefully edited version of his own story. Now, Daniel presents the original trial script from the Théâtre des Vampires, with Armand's notes scrawled in the margins, in red ink, stage directions, character blocking, etc. Armand didn't fail to stop the trial. He directed the trial. And the person who actually saved Louis, who forced the audience to demand banishment instead of death, you guessed it, Lestat. The man Louis and Claudia tried to murder quietly used his influence to spare Louis's life and never once said a word about it. Louis nearly kills Armand right there in the penthouse. He doesn't, but he does end their relationship and walks out. Flies back to New Orleans, finds Lestat in their old, now crumbling house during a hurricane playing the piano. They finally acknowledge their shared grief over Claudia. They reconcile, not necessarily as lovers, but as two people who are the only ones who truly understand their shared history. And what about Daniel Malloy? Armand ended up turning him after Louis left Dubai. Louis's command was not to harm Daniel, so technically he kind of saved him from his illness by turning him. It's a gray area. The book, Interview with the Vampire, is published. And now, vampires worldwide are pissed. The season ends with Louis back in Dubai, sending an open invitation to every vampire on Earth. The message is basically, bring it on, you cowardly bitches. And that's where Interview with the Vampire Season 2 comes to an end. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to recapping another show for you very soon.